Hi, everyone. It's always nice when somebody talks back. Hi. Oh, you've got extra mics.
Ooh. All right.
So we'd like to start just with opening with a quote. This is something that we do within intentional peer support. And I guess it's just to ground us in where we're going with this. And I'm opening with a quote from the Aboriginal activist group from Queensland, and this is from the 1970s. And the quote is, "If you have come to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." And so we're going to be talking about what this means and how it's important to peer support and to intentional peer support. We're going to do a little bit of a journey. We'll talk about where intentional peer support came from, the movement that it grew out of. We'll tell you a little bit about what it is. And we'll give you some examples of where we've seen this implemented into practice and where we've seen it work particularly well. And then we'll be open to questions if you have any. So I'm going to pass over to Chris.
Greetings. Kia ora tātou katoa from my homeland, New Zealand. My name is Chris Hansen, and I bring to you my chief qualification for this, which is my own lived experience of using and surviving psychiatry, being locked up, and realising that the people who did most for my sense of wanting to do well were not the people paid to be there. They were the people in the smoking room where I took up smoking, because that's where the best conversations were. Now, ironically, I was actually working as a clinician and a manager in a mental health service when this all happened, and I lost my job, I lost my house, I lost custody of a kid, I lost many things, and so I responded by reincarnating myself as a bit of an activist from hell, working within the New Zealand system to represent people who used mental health services. And I also realised that I really wanted, while I was doing the activism, which included some human rights activism working on the United Nations Convention for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, that if I was looking at and talking about what didn't work, that we also needed to be dedicating ourselves to what did work. And so that's where we're placing this talk to you today. We've heard this morning a lot about some of the flaws in the system and how we've got stuck there. We've heard some stories of people who have used the system and have found pathways forward. And now we're going to talk about what our work is, which is intentional peer support. So I want to start a little as I did yesterday. So some of you will have heard a little bit of this from yesterday, with where we came from as intentional peer support. And yesterday I said, mad love, mad pride, and mad revolution, or viva la revolution. So we heard this morning about some of the reasons that we're angry, and the system is broken. Many of us have felt marginalised, oppressed, abused. Some people have even called it torture. And as human beings, we want to stand up and claim our rights and claim our citizenship and say there are many ways forward. Psychiatry is only one of them, and we want to claim our right as citizens in our communities, in our families, in our societies, and with the people that we love, and even the people that we don't love. We want to be proud, and there's mad pride. You can see there. So July 14th, Bastille Day, is the day that internationally has been claimed as Mad Pride Day, and it's just an uprising of the people to say, we're not ashamed of who we are, we're proud of who we are, and we are not going to be suppressed and squeezed into somebody else's view of normality. We want to be out there because we are the ones who create the colour and the life and the beauty and the innovation, and we stretch people outside their comfort zones, and that is not a bad thing. There are many good things about that. So the third piece is Mad Love, which is about support. It's about we will support one another through. We don't need to be solely the recipients of other people's expertise. That many of us have found pathways through where we can stand proud and value our experience. We don't have to hide it under a bushel. We don't have to be ashamed of it, but we can claim it. And that is our greatest asset. And I want to say that to all of you who are working as clinicians, as people who work in the system, that brought you here into this work. And maybe it was your own lived experience. Maybe it was the lived experience of people in your family or your circle who you love, or some difficult experiences. That's a precious gift. And that's something that you need to take and nurture and treat as a treasure rather than hide and be ashamed of. And I personally think, and this is an aside, I hadn't written this into what I was going to say, but if those of us who work in mental health services could find effective ways to support one another and be upfront about our own struggles, our own lived experience, our own distress, then I think that the people who receive our services would get a much better service, because they wouldn't be experiencing that shame that parallel processes itself down through our system. And we ourselves, or you yourselves, because I don't no longer work in the system in that way, would be much less likely to burn out and get jaded and sceptical. Anyway, I realise I'm probably preaching to the choir because you're here, so thank you. So intentional peer support also grew out of Sherry Mead, who was the founder of intentional peer support. Her own lived experience as a 16-year-old, she got put in a hospital, diagnosed with schizophrenia, told that she'd never get out and she'd had to throw out all the medication, never work. And she managed to, she threw out the medication she told she'd be on all her life, and escaped to Boston and lived as a musician for 10 years. And as a 30-something-year-old coming out of a bad marriage, started to go in and out of psych hospitals again, and was challenged to do something different. And so she actually went back and did some postgraduate study, and built what we know as the world's first peer-run respite. But what she discovered when she was in the system was that 5 minutes in a psychiatric hospital and you're already a mental patient. That's her words. And she realised that we become these helpless recipients because that's the way to show that you're compliant, and that's the way to get out of the system. And yet those of us who have been there know that often it's an act of non-compliance, an act of defiance that actually is our first important step to reclaiming who we are and being able to move on. So they developed a group to support one another and to challenge one another, and to challenge one another to do some of the difficult and hard things. She also noticed she was doing an internship at a domestic violence shelter, and noticed that people would come out of the shelter come into the shelter, and they would be told, you're strong, you're a survivor, well done. And then they'd be sent to a clinician, because this is the United States and it's costs money to go to a clinician, but this was free, so they'd make the most of it, and they'd come out with a pill bottle saying, I'm seriously mentally ill. And as a survivor of domestic abuse herself, Sherry thought there is something seriously wrong with that. And really decided to work with people to support one another and find other ways to make meaning of their experiences. So, after reflecting on these on this together, the group came up with some practices to try and break out of the entrenched patterns of helping, because we do what's been done to us. We only know what we know. So often, if you put somebody in a role and you say, you're a peer supporter, do peer support, we will just do what's been done to us in the system because we don't know any better. And that's where intentional peer support grew from. They developed a peer-run respite as an alternative to hospitals and hospitalisations, and really worked to challenge one another to have difficult conversations and to find new and fresh ways to make meaning of their experience. That you have some chemicals going wrong in your body is one view, but there's a myriad of other ways of making sense of what's happening. It could be that I'm having a spiritual awakening. It could be that I'm having an artistic creative experience. It could be that I'm releasing the grief from the trauma that I've experienced all my life, and this is a natural response to some pretty hideous events. There are hundreds of thousands of different ways that we can make meaning of our experiences, and Sherry had learnt in Boston that she could be pretty kind of crazy and stay awake all night, dance, sleep all day, dance naked in the moonlight. I don't think she did that. She wouldn't be happy that I said that. But you can do that sort of thing and get away with it because you're a crazy artist and a crazy musician. That's what you do. But if you're in a much more conservative community, you're much more likely to get locked up. So if you want to learn more about intentional peer support, you can find about it on our website, intentionalpeersupport.org, and there's a really great story there called A Personal Retrospective, which is Sherry's story. It's a good read. You can also watch it as she does it as a keynote. And I wanted to just say we're not anti or pro-psychiatry. We take a critical perspective. And what we really want is for people to be able to make informed choices and to see biomedical psychiatry as like one little room in a huge mansion. We want to take 3 of the walls down, or maybe all the walls down, and say there are so many other ways of navigating through our lives. You have the right to return to that room and look at all the other ways that we have of making meaning.
Is this mic working? It is. Hello. Hi, everyone. So I'll be talking you through the 3 principles and the 4 tasks of IPS. And Chris is telling me I need to introduce myself, so I'll do that too. My name is Amanda. I work with IPS, Intentional Peer Support. I'll tell you a bit about the role that I've done with peer support in a little later of the segment, but I'll just walk you through these, what it's founded on really, and what our goals are and how we really work through those goals and get to where we're going. So the 3 principles that we're trying to achieve when doing these tasks are from helping to learning together, from individual to responsibility, and from fear to hope and possibility. So I'll walk through each one, and then I'll talk about the tasks. So from helping to learning together, this is mainly based on the idea that often when we engage with a service, or we engage in any kind of any mental health, really, any mental health spaces, there always tends to be somebody who is on the receiving end of help and somebody who is providing that help. We tend to step into a problem-solving space and tend to address whatever that issue is. If it's a diagnosis, a disorder, a problem, we're going to try to find a solution. And in IPS, we try to take an approach of learning together, navigating what we don't even use the word problem, just navigating whatever this experience is as two people who are coming together, and abandoning the roles of, I'm going to help you find what you're looking for, because I might not even know, and you might not even know, but together, I think Lisa used a really good example yesterday, so I'll use that, and if you heard it yesterday, no, you didn't. I'm going to use it now. So she kind of gave this example of going traveling, and sometimes when you go traveling, you can go, to a tour guide, and they'll, show you everything you need to know. They'll say, this is where you need to go, and this is what you need to do, and that's kind of a helping method. Where in IPS, we look to two people who are traveling to a place that they've never been to together, and thinking, what do I like to do? What do you like to do? And I've never been here. Let's kind of explore the area. Let's see what we want. Let's find what works for the both of us. And that's kind of the approach that we hope to take with our peer support. The second principle being from individual to relationship. What I'm about to say is going to sound very similar to the first one, but it's not. From individual to relationship is looking at the weight of responsibility, looking at the weight of who's contributing to the relationship, and sharing that weight equally. When I said, we tend to help somebody, we tend to focus on that individual, and we don't really think about the dynamic between the two people, and that dynamic and the space between the two people being therapeutic within itself, tending to the relationship, having boundaries set between two people, and being able to explore communication, being able to say, I'm uncomfortable, or I didn't actually like that, or I really like what you said, or feeling that you can even share, you can swear. It's a relationship. It's not just one person who is coming to you and then, that's what you're focusing on. I'll try to give a personal example of my own work in peer support and how that manifests, but when I think about people that I've worked with in the past, and that relational aspect, being able to say, like, I actually really didn't appreciate when you said that to me, and it made me quite uncomfortable, and it actually brought up a lot of things for me. And that's not something that you would see in a conventional setting in clinical services. You wouldn't be able to say, like, as a clinician, oh, I actually really didn't like that, it made me uncomfortable, can we reframe it? So looking at that relational dynamic is really important when it comes to IPS. And the third principle being fear to hope and possibility. So I think of fear, and I think of the way that sometimes we respond to mental illness. There's so many different presentations in the way that we kind of see stigma in our society around mental illness. Sometimes it's like, oh my goodness, we have to avoid these conversations. We respond in a way that might be, based off of fear. Someone might say something to us, and we don't know how to navigate it. So we're just like, okay, let's solve this. I'm afraid, or I'll refer you on because it's obviously very serious, or whatever it is. We might jump from a place of fear. We might move from a place of I don't know. And instead of navigating from that place of fear, we're looking to kind of consider honesty, maybe, and what's possible, right? So somebody may come to us and say something along the lines of, I don't want to carry on anymore, or I don't want to continue when the life I'm living. And instead of saying, okay, well, let's see how we can get this, and we can refer you here and get you on this, it's more so, okay, well, tell me what that might mean for you. What are you hoping for? What's going on? What's happened? Exploring that with a curiosity can allow us to open up to different possibilities for what that person might mean and what might be possible, really. And so that's kind of the approach that we're hoping to take is not a fear-based one, but all that being said, it can be quite difficult. I've been there before. So we aim to work through these three principles together, but through connection, worldview, mutuality, and moving towards. So connection is quite self-explanatory in the sense that, when I spoke about from individual to relationship, we're looking at how, you know, what the connection is like. But oftentimes, you know, you go to any kind of peer support training or any kind of training, and they say connection like it's going to happen overnight, like you'll just automatically connect with someone. But I'm sure everyone in the room can vouch to experiencing not connecting with someone initially, and actually maybe not even liking somebody, or there being initially disconnect. And so when we talk about connection, we're talking about connection, disconnection, and reconnection, and the ability to navigate that, to say, you know what, that actually was a disconnect for me. I can feel there being a disconnect here. And then also connecting on the groundwork of things like worldview, mutuality, which I'll get to next. And then exploring how do we reconnect once we have disconnected. And establishing a groundwork that isn't just always around mental health. You can connect with somebody about something that has nothing to do with their mental health, and it can help their mental health tremendously. So exploring that possibility too. Worldview, and I'll speak a lot more about this when I talk about my work with young people of color, but worldview being, in brief, the way that you navigate the world, the way that you see things, the way that you've come to understand things, the way that you come to understand yourself, the people around you, your environment, all just based off of experiences, lived experiences that have brought you to where you are today. And having that curiosity to understand somebody who's in front of you, and vice versa. Understand, yeah, I'm going to understand your worldview. I'm making eye contact with you, your worldview, and then you're going to understand mine. We're going to take the time to connect. So I can say, instead of, you know, what's wrong with you? What happened? How did we get here? And having that understanding, and it can open up a different realm of possibilities, because now I truly have taken the time to understand how you got here and how you see the world. Mutuality, so this one's my favorite. It's looking at kind of power dynamics, power imbalance, which is something that I know we're quite familiar with. Somebody, when we think about help, you know, the person who's coming to get help, we're going to a professional. We're going to somebody who knows more than I know about my experience somehow. And so when we think about mutuality, it's this idea that we're the same, you and I. You have your own set of experiences, I have mine, and we're trying to erase all power within this relationship. It can be quite difficult when, you know, maybe you're in peer support and you're being paid to do it, and then there's that difference in the room. But even just addressing and coming down to that mutual place. Mutuality might look different. It might look like somebody having to get a step ladder to see eye to eye, but it's always in the room and just being aware of you both contributing. But it's a give and take. And then the last one being moving towards. So moving towards is, well, in very brief words, it's kind of moving forward or backward or to the side. But it's moving in a way that isn't necessarily always goal-oriented. It's not always set out. It's not always prescriptive. But when we think about hope and possibility, it's that we're moving towards it might just be the unknown, really, and accepting that we will figure it out together. And as time goes on, you might say, what I want to move towards is just being more open. I might want to move towards, I don't know. I want to move towards being able to connect with the person that I've lost connection with. I want to be able to move towards, and just having that ability and flexibility to see what we can do and how we can reach it without there being prescription on it, without there being hard set goals by this amount of time and this amount of weeks and so on and so forth, and then I can report it back and I know it was successful. It's just the ability to say you're moving from where you were before and moving onward, and it can look completely different from what you originally set out to do. But that's kind of what moving towards encompasses. And I hope that I summed it up pretty well.
Thank you so much. All right. Hub. So we're going to talk a little bit about who is IPS Central, who we are, and our a model of how we operate very briefly, and then we're going to give a few examples. Then I'm going to briefly tell a story that illustrates this, and then we're going to end.
We did have another version of the slideshow, which is kind of throwing me because that should be on a nice slide now, which tells you. So I don't know if there is a tech person who would be able to help us switch the slides over. If not, I'm just going to quickly try.
All right. While Lisa does that, actually, I will... faster than a speeding rocket. So I will tell my story. So Charlie was a young man who lived in Claremont, New Hampshire in the United States. And when he often experienced some pretty extreme states, and when he did, he'd go and he'd lie in the middle of the highway and believing it would bring peace in the Middle East. And the first time he did that, the police were called. He was put in the paddy wagon, the police car. He was taken to the cells. He was physically and chemically restrained, and he was in the hospital for about a month. Second time it happened, they said, oh, this guy's been in the hospital before. They called the ambulance. The ambulance came. They put him in the psych hospital. He was shot up with psych drugs, and he was in the hospital for about 3 months. And he lost his house, he lost his job, he lost almost all of his possessions. Third time, he had a friend called Rob who was working at this very new then peer respite, and he saw Charlie lying in the middle of the road, and he decided he'd go out. He actually was very courageous. He put his hand up and he stopped the traffic. And he bent down to Charlie and he said, hey, mate, I know this is really important to you, and you're scaring me. And how about you come and have a cup of coffee? I'd like to hear about what's going on, and I'm hoping that we can sort this out, because one of the things that scares me is that the police or the ambulance are going to come and pick you up again. And he bent down and he took Charlie's hand, and he was still holding the traffic up, and they walked to the other side of the road and they sat down and they had coffee, and there was this brand new peer respite, and they were able to get Charlie a place there for a couple of weeks, and he stayed awake all day and all night for about 4 or 5 days and nights, and he talked non-stop. And the good thing about it was there were people who did work shifts, and so they were able to just sort of relieve one another and allow Charlie to talk. And then he slept for about 4 days and nights after that. And after 10 days or so, a couple of weeks, he got out, and he hadn't had massive whacks of psychiatric drugs. He didn't lose his house. He didn't lose his job. And he had this new community. And he went and actually ended up going and doing a master's in eco-psychology. And I tell you that story because it illustrates the tasks, the principles and tasks relatively well. Instead of jumping in and taking power, which, helping sometimes has this coercive element, Rob came in and he worked at connecting. He said, hey, he validated him. I know this is important to you. Why don't we go and have a cup of coffee? Such a stark difference from being picked up, restrained, put in the police van. He focused on the relationship. He acknowledged Charlie, and he also asked for what he needed. He said, you're scaring me, and I'd like us to sit down and have a conversation. I'm invested in this relationship, even though I don't understand what's going on. And instead of fear, and let's face it, there's a lot in our traditional systems that is very fear-based, he had the hope that they could work something out together. And that took courage, actually, I have to say. He worked to connect. He acknowledged him. He took his hand. He took him over for a cup of coffee. He wanted to listen to his worldview. He acknowledged, even though he didn't understand what lying in the middle of the road had to do with peace in the Middle East, he was willing to listen. And he was also willing to ask for what he needed, which is mutuality. Mutuality is also often talking about how this touches me. I know that there have been times when I've been convinced that, if I stay awake all night and, chant 50 times, that it's going to make my mother come back into my father's life or something. So sometimes it's just about being able to validate and connect and reveal a little bit of yourself. And then that magic is what we call moving towards. It's like, it's not focusing on what we don't want. How much focus is there on how are you sleeping, how are you eating, how are your voices, how's your anxiety, are you still thinking of suicide? It's all about what we don't want. But instead, he just allowed for some possibilities to emerge, and that could have been anything. So that's my story. Are we sorted?
I wanted to find the Nebraska video, but
I know. So
I'll just talk about it. It's fine, the structure.
Oh, okay.
I had a really fancy slide that I made, and my laptop's just died, and it was on my data stick, and, sometimes life happens. So if you imagine a map of the world, I'm going to talk you through, actually, as Chris said, this grew out of one person's story and experience, and it was never really meant or designed in a way that IPS would then suddenly become this thing that grew the way that it did, but it has. And so I'm going to just tell you a little bit about what that looks like. Obviously, a fancy map would show you where in the world we are, but you'll just have to use your imagination. So IPS Central is actually a very little team. There's us 3 here, and we have 3 more colleagues. 2, 3? Yeah, and Helen. So there's three more of us. So we're a really small team, and we cover everywhere through what we call a hub model. So we've started to notice that particular places in the world had an energy for this. It started to grow. People were looking for this thing we call social change. They wanted to do something different. That can often be people who just have had this experience themselves, and they've maybe been working in peer support, or maybe they've just have a lived experience and they want to connect with other people who do. And through this, we ended up supporting people in particular places to grow what we call hubs. So we have a lot of IPS now happening in Australia, in New Zealand, in Japan, in 4 different states in the US, New Hampshire, Oregon, Vermont, Maine, lots of places. And then, as you know, because you're here, we're also starting to grow some activities, some communities in Europe. And Norway's one of the countries where we have a hub, and Iceland's obviously one of the other countries that we're looking at growing a community here. And that, I suppose what I want to say is that IPS has grown in a way that's very different from other peer support trainings. I worked in peer support for a very long time, and every other training that I had accessed was kind of grown out of a boardroom by people who wanted to make the peer workforce better. And so it was a kind of artificial thing that was kind of glossy. And then intentional peer support has instead grown out of this social movement that Chris was talking about. It grew out of people who had lived experience, who had communities of mutuality, and they wanted to do something different. And so it wasn't constructed in a way that was about making systems and services better. It was actually something that was quite relational. And so when I first did the IPS training, I had been working in peer support for probably about 10 or 15 years. And like Chris was saying, we often end up doing things that kind of replicates what we know. So I had been doing peer support in a way that was very much like support work. And so I got stuck in a lot of this space around fear. I thought I couldn't have conversations about difficult topics. I was worried about saying the wrong thing. I thought that I would make situations worse if I talked to people about it, and so I would refer people on, shut the conversation down. And intentional peer support does something different. And seeing this growing across different places, it's growing into what it needs to be within that country, in that culture. And we're seeing that we have some translations now. Actually, Norway was one of the countries that recently translated the materials. And so what people do is pick up this really simple framework, approach, structure, and they make it work where they are. It's driven by people and it's relational. So we've got translated materials in Spanish, French, Norwegian, Japanese. There's some Te Reo Māori articles and resources.
A little bit in Hebrew.
A little bit in Hebrew and a little bit in Dutch. And so,
Possibly Mandarin.
so yes, many different languages. And there will be more. And so it's something that I guess is becoming like a kind of gift or a growth within the communities. And I want to just draw on this quote from Sherry, which is actually just thinking about like what is the intention behind some of this, like what's our intention as intentional peer support and within our communities. And this was a really important quote for me because for a long time I thought that as I worked in peer support, my job was about making the system better, about making services better. But actually what I realised that through having really meaningful conversations and relationships with people, there was a kind of trickle effect that systems and services changed, but it didn't need to be my sole intention. And so Sherry says, as peer support in mental health grows, we must be mindful of our intention, social change. It's not about developing more effective services, but rather about creating dialogues that influence on all of our understandings, conversations, and relationships. Yes, I was going to tell you about I have a really good video that actually I would really like to have shown, which was from one of our projects in Nebraska. But I'll pass over to Chris in a minute and she can tell you about a couple of other projects. But where we've seen this implement has been different in different places. And so I'll give an example from New Zealand. I lived in New Zealand for 6 or 7 years, and then Amanda will share an example from the UK. So in New Zealand after the earthquakes, there was quite a lot of people were being diagnosed with anxiety disorders, with depression, and people were feeling like their only supports were often the mental health system. And conversations were quite stuck in people being told there's something wrong with you. But there had been a significant collective trauma, what happened in this community. And so some of us who were there in the few years after that had got together, who were used to working in peer spaces, and we started to think about doing something different. We created what we call listening posts, where we would just create spaces where people could come together and meet and gather and just talk. And so it was something that sat separately in libraries, in communities, and cafes, where people could just talk about the experiences they'd had and meet with other people who had shared experiences. The community ended up becoming a trust called Thrive in Madly. I went on to leave the country, but it continued to thrive madly. And it does amazing events such as burlesque nights and performance nights and makes craft monkeys and all sorts. And it's about just creating spaces where people come together, they gather, and they can just talk with no expectation that you're going to get worse, get better, be ill, be well. It's that real connection piece where we're just gathering with no intention other than just to be together. And I think I'm going to pass on to, do you want to go in then, Amanda?
Yep, sure.
To Chris.
Yeah, I want to talk about another project. Oh, thank you. Yes, but I don't know how to get it on there. Nina's going to work some Nina Tech wizardry, so I'm going to hand over to Amanda to talk about hearts and minds, and then if Nina's been able to be a wizard, then
I'm gonna stand over here so you're all distracted, and you have to look at me, and that's not happening. So I'm gonna talk about my experience working at an organization called Hearts and Minds. It was in London during the pandemic, and it was a specific group that was set up for young people of color. I was the young person of color peer support group facilitator. Say that 10 times fast. But it was it was a really fruitful project that I was on working with these young people. I supported people ages 16 to 25, and I wrote a bunch of things down that is over there about how beneficial it was, but I'll just talk about it, I guess. And so for me, I came to IPS because it was all academic at first. When I first moved to England, I moved for my master's, and I saw this post, and all my research was around intersectionality of young Black people. As a young Black person, it felt apt, and I understood it, and I really cared about the community. And I saw this post, and I thought I could do that. And all the research was pointing in kind of a glaringly obvious way that young black people, and specifically young black men, were not engaging with mental health services. There's this very large idea of stigma in the community, and that reigns true. There's stereotyping, there's racism, there's discrimination, and the general idea is that they just didn't feel understood by well, to be frank, white clinicians, white middle-aged clinicians weren't getting it, and they felt like they had to essentially put a lot of legwork in to make them understand their worldview from the jump, and felt like the second they entered the room, if they ever even got there, they were a bunch of ideas of them, preconceived notions of them when they entered the room. And so having all these young black people in the space, and I had other people who were not just black. I had I'll just say it was a global majority, really. What I found a lot, and what was not just I found, but was told to me, was that there was this baseline idea of worldview. And yeah, there was some variance between individual experiences, as you would expect, but no one had to explain their culture. No one had to explain their parents' decision-making, or what it was like to be an immigrant, or what it felt like to be, have a microaggression, or no one was worried about somebody touching their hair or having to, they didn't have to make any of those allowances, and they didn't have to what's the word I'm looking for? They didn't have to put up anything. The mask was off, and there was no need to play to any kind of, areas of whiteness to make people feel comfortable. So that was already established in that group, which was really, really beneficial. The second thing that was so nice about that space is, young people, at that time, everyone's trying to get approval of their peers anyway. So we're in a peer space, and they're feeling validated by people who are of the same age, but there's also this sense of autonomy. There's no prescription. There's no power dynamic. There's no one above you telling you that you need to do this, this, and this, and this. And I know everyone here has been 17 and been told they need to do something and been like, well, I'm not gonna, now that you've told me to. But being in the space, it was that shared idea, which was really nice. And yeah, the power imbalance had kind of slipped away. And the decision of, this is my mental health and this is how I want to progress forward, and this group of people is just going to help me move to whatever it is, that was really, really successful as well. Unfortunately, and it's something that I think is important to note, funding was cut, and so we had to stop the group. But I know to this day, some of the members still meet on their own and just go get coffees and support each other still. And so I can just say that I know for a fact it's been fruitful. I've seen people engage in a way that I know they wouldn't have engaged in clinical services. And it's been more than fruitful.
Thank you so much. So, intentional peer support is practiced in a range of grassroots community organisations, peer organisations, and in some mental health services, and also statewide in a number of states in the United States. And there's some really innovative, out-of-the-box, to use a recently used phrase, initiatives. And I just wanted to showcase one, which was in Nebraska, a state in the middle America, in prisons. And one group had some work in the prisons, and they took intentional peer support and they taught it to inmates who were working with, these were all men who were locked up in the hole in solitary confinement. And they have a peer support program where they will go in and support people who are in solitary. It's hard for most of us, I think, to imagine, but the results have been extraordinary, and the reports out have been absolutely stunning. So I'm going to not say anything more about that. We're going to just play a brief video about this.
The IPS program is an intentional peer support system. It is designed to be able to help individuals by helping them find the means to help themselves.
The IPS program is based on hope.
IPS is building mutual responsible relationships where we both learn and grow together.
The IPS program is a program that has a lot of people who are supporting each other and building relationships among each other.
I have a story, and I believe everyone has a story. So when we're allowed to share our stories, especially with peers, we get the opportunity to, I believe, to heal.
That they have value, that they're a person, and that they all have individual characteristics and strengths that need to be drawn out.
So I had a IPS guy in my life who was pretty much consistent with me when I was going through, dealing with a lot of my transgressions. And just the concern that he had for me, the care he had for me, the consistency that he had for me, just showing up every day and just being there, hey man, let's sign up for some classes, let's do this, let's do that. It's one of them things to where, I told myself that I could do the same thing.
All right. And clearly they practice this beyond just solitary because they're sitting there in a group playing cards. So, yeah, I just wondered if you wanted to put that, are able to put that quote up again.
And I managed to get through 3 laptops, 2 data.
What we mostly do is training, and when we train trainers, one of the things I say is that part of the secret is just being able to roll with any unexpected that comes your way, particularly the tech unexpecteds. And it's really useful to have a secret tech wizard in your midst as well. So, okay, so I was just going to ask Amanda to read the social change slide that we have again, and then we're going to ask for questions.
Oh, I'm going to read this slide. Okay. As peer support and mental health grows, we must be mindful of our intention. Social change is not about developing more effective services, but rather about creating dialogues that influence on all of our understandings, conversations, and relationships.
Thank you so much. So I'm just going to open it up for questions.
Any questions?
Also available for technology training, obviously, if anybody needs it.
So if no questions from the auditorium, we should just give them a big round of applause. Thank you.